Okay, to follow up with the next part of the social history. So as I finished up last time, you have the Yamato clan coming to power, or the Yamato Uji, if you want to be more accurate, coming to power. And then I mentioned that you end up with this sort of paradox that even though they're in control, in fact, that family still is the imperial family today. So after 1400 years or something like that, what happens is they're not actually politically in charge. They become, if you would, the ritual heads of Japanese society, which is pretty much what they've been for the rest of the 1400 years, with the exception of the Meiji emperor in the 1860s, 1870s. um, so, so what you have then is clans clans competing for authority. Again, as I mentioned last time, if you think of this way back in the day, where you had prime ministers interpreting, if you would, for shamans, sorceresses who were out of contact with the population. So this idea that you have an interface or an intermediary, and while on one hand the intermediary is supposed to be there to help, they're like a chief of staff or a executive secretary or something like that. They're supposed to help things happen. But in the Japanese system, what happens is almost from the get-go is if you're one of these executive assistants or whatever you want to call them, you end up taking over all the authority. So you just sort of ignore the fact that you're supposed to be you sort of ignore the fact you're supposed to be working for someone, and you just sort of make yourself the new head of the system. This is Japanese history from 700 AD right down to, I'd argue, 2026. Um, Ritual power is entirely segregated from political, military, social power. The two have they're entirely different groups, and they've really got nothing in common. They intersect at certain points, obviously, but the two are different. That's one reason why, unlike any place else I can think of, as I mentioned last time, you don't see any particular need to get rid of the imperial family if you want to be the new guy in charge. All you have to do is get rid of the existing executive assistants to the imperial family, take care of those jobs, and you've done what you want to do. No reason to get rid of the guys in charge because they're not really in charge of anything. Now, where this becomes plausible and also real complicated, and this is where Japanese, as I mentioned last time, I think in finishing, this is where Japanese society is totally different than Korean or Chinese society. Is in Chinese and Korean society, Chinese society especially, clan family ties are absolutely central. Clan family ties define who you are, they define what you're going to be, your relationship with the rest of society, you name it. Japanese society replaces those. People have family ties to a very limited extent, but they don't use them. Well, I'm not sure if use them is right. I'm not even sure people are sort of aware of them. They're not really relevant, maybe the best way to phrase them. What happens in Japan is that gets replaced by where you live. So rather than who your family's last name is, it's what your address is becomes absolutely central. And I think I finished up with this last time. This would be the idea of the vast majority of the population becoming bei, or basically serfs, peasants, living in those large thatched buildings, and that might have two or three different groups of people who really aren't genealogically necessarily part of the same close clan, but because they live in the same place, because they work the same fields, they become identified as a group, and they see themselves that way. So what happens, if you would, is clan family gets replaced by residence uh, and neighborhood, and that's still very true in Japanese society today. And nothing that Japanese do makes any sense unless you realize that they don't do things in the Chinese style. They are a totally different society. They happen to be near China, but boy, they play the game totally differently. If you ever want to see this, go watch the really old but very very beautiful movie Ron by Akira Kurosawa, where you actually see, and this is actually based on Japanese, history of the ruling, some of the ruling clans in I think the 14, 1500s. So in the Chinese system, you'd always work within the clan. In the Japanese system, some of your worst enemies might actually be your close relatives, um, because each individual or each small family group, based on where they live, are going to see themselves as an autonomous unit. And so your competition might very well people who in the Chinese system would be close relatives, your clan members. Totally different game. Um, in this system, then, because clan doesn't define your social networks, clan doesn't define, if you would, who you are or what you can get. Then what happens is the Japanese replace the clan system or the family network, if you would, in China, with what's usually called a vertical alliance system. And what this means is that in the Japanese system, what happens is people based on their residence or shared experience. In the modern context, this would be the neighborhood you grew up in, and especially the schools you go to, basically define who your network of available potential, useful people are. And in that, there's very little interest or almost no context for people with the same last name. They're not relevant unless they live next to you or with you. And so what happens then is that people develop networks with around the folks around them, regardless of where they fit, if you would, in the status system. So you can have samurai who are, your upper class militaristic population who have social networks with merchants or even with commoners underneath them. You have commoners who have, within the variable rank of commoners, very close relationships with folks in that system or with merchants, even though they're different social status, different social standing, and they have different last names. But at some point, given their shared experiences, they grew up together, they went to school together, or did something together. They become buddies, I guess, for lack of a better term. And this is the Japanese system. This is how Japan operates today. Japan and China operate entirely differently. So what this means is if you're looking at cycles, and again, Japanese history cycles just like Chinese history, but it doesn't cycle for the same reasons and it doesn't cycle in the same ways. What happens is collective members of a group, oftentimes members maybe partially of the same clan, but also folks who are, aligned by virtue of being from the same region, for example, or same place, or in many cases having been under a daimyo or regional warlord together. So they sort of shared that, collective, employment, I guess, for lack of a better term. Um, those folks will get together, and one or two or more of these clans will get together, and they'll take control, political, military control of all or part of Japan. And this becomes, this is the Ashikagas, this is the Minamotos, the Taira, and this would be, of course, the Tokugawas in the last period. And what happens is one of those groups like the Ashikaga come to power, but that's a collective, and it's based largely on the relationships of the folks that are alive when this happens. As those folks pass and their kids or relatives take over, is very quickly this whole thing sort of unravels because they don't have the same sense of shared whatever it might be, And so what happens is they quickly see each other as either potential competition or why do we put up with them or something like that. And then you end up with collapse and you end up with civil wars with the different, regional warlords and such like that. Again, similar to the Chinese system, struggling for power. Eventually, when the dust settles, you've got a new collection of these people, this new Uji, but it's not a clan in the way the Chinese operate because it's going to be this set of relationships of folks that for some reason have shared experience. They're going to be the new guys in charge. And so what happens is they take over and then they end up in charge for a while and the whole thing falls apart again. So Japanese history, just like everything else, Japanese see their physical world around them as being uncertain and change and pretty random. Japanese political control is exactly the same. It doesn't have the same structure to it as Chinese control. Chinese control, you can't really set a clock by it, but you can see, if you look at the different periods of Chinese history, you can see, okay, this is when they get started. And this is when, the population buys into it. This is when it gets a little more problematic, and this is when it falls apart. And the key part in the Chinese system, as I've mentioned a bunch of times, is the Chinese system is based on populist support. The Japanese system is never based on that. In Japan, no one in the Ujis cares about what commoners think. Serfs and peasants are there to be spear carriers and or provide food or cannon fodder or whatever. They're not, you never pay attention to them and you never PR them. It would have never occurred to the Tokugawas when they took over in the late 1500s that they had to worry about the commoners. They used them. That was actually a large part of their army was guys, commoners with muskets. But the minute the war ended, they disbanded them, actually shipped a bunch of the guys off to Hokkaido and took their guns back. because samurai were totally different than commoners. Samurai and peasants had nothing in common. In fact, as we'll see, sort of as a classic, well, sort of jump ahead, but not too much. Um, the system by the 12, 1300s is that your military elites are samurai. And so what happens is sort of this upper 5 or 10% of Japanese society is trained from childhood to be militaristic. They're the military. And so they're the ones with the skill set. And that's the image you still see in all the samurai movies and stuff like that. That's the guys in the armor with the swords, et cetera, et cetera. And in some ways, their code of Bushido is somewhat similar to the concept of chivalry in Europe, because Bushido's main function is to make the samurai unique from everyone else, in the same way that chivalry was only something that knights could do. If you weren't of that social elite, you could never be, part of the system. And it's even more so in Japan. If you weren't part of the samurai elite, you could never be part of the system. And so what happens is different guys come to power, but the ranks in which you get the players come from are the same. And the names change, if you would, but it's the same pocket of names. It's the same club. It's the same box of names. It's just which ones win this time versus which ones win that time. So as I've got here, you've got the sort of quick, dirty shopping list of these various guys to power. The only exception to this, I just mentioned this just in passing, is Hideyoshi, who comes to power as the warlord under control. Well, Nobunaga comes to power, so he's actually one of these leaders who he said his Uji comes to power. He passes away. He's actually assassinated. And his chief general, who was actually a commoner, who was actually, originally a peasant, comes to power and becomes the new head of that group. Now he can do that in the Japanese system because one, he's the best at it. So he'd rather ruthlessly make sure all the competition disappears. But also because this is a vertical alliance system, the Japanese, the other leaders don't get as freaked out as they would say in the Chinese system. He's not as much of an outsider because he'd gone through the same experiences. He's part of the same group. He too was loyal to Nobunaga. In fact, that's what brings him to authority. Now, having said that, one of the other families or ujis that's underneath Nobunaga is the Tokugawas. And once Nobunaga isn't around, who was the guy they all swore allegiance to, they see Hideyoshi and his relatives, his kids when he passes away, as being vulnerable. And also, that's not they didn't swear allegiance to him. I mean, they might have done it, well, they did do it. They swore allegiance to him in a formal ceremony, but they didn't mean it. They meant it when they swore allegiance to Nobunaga. I think that's largely because they were pretty sure if they didn't, he was going to clean their clock. So what happens is the Tokugawas revolt against Hideyoshi's, control the Uji and wipe his family out and then take over that, and that becomes the Tokugawa shogunate. So your elites, the guys that win the lottery, if you would, or win the control game, usually define themselves as the shogun, or more accurately, Seitai shogun. Let's switch over here. And this is typically Japanese. This term means nothing. Seitai shogun is actually a Japanese phonetic alliteration for what in China would be the general in charge of I can remember if the Western frontier would be the Northwestern frontier. It's the folks, the general in charge of dealing with the Mongols, which would be the Northwest. And I can't remember what the term is in Chinese, but anyways, that general had a particular title. Now the Japanese, because they're getting this constant, material and ideas and concepts and stuff coming in from China, take a look at the Chinese bureaucracy and they think, whoa, hey, that's a really good idea. But you have to remember in the Chinese system, the first emperor sets it up to replace the clans. In the Japanese system, what they said is they see the bureaucracy as a group of subordinates who are going to keep the clan or the Uji in power. So the bureaucracy in Japan never has the leverage that it does in China. The bureaucracy in Japan never has the status that it does in China. And they never have the political control or pull that they do in China. They're always subordinates to the various Uji or the various clans in power. And so what happens is, I think it's I'm not sure if it's the Taira or the Ashikaga. I think maybe the Taira are the ones that first come up with the term of the same Seitai shogun. What they decide is whichever Uji, whichever guy is now in charge of Japan. Now remember, it's not the imperial family. They're off doing something, somewhere else, under control, under protection, under protection of the Uji that's now one military political power. And so they decide this gets really complicated. So what you want to do is we're going to give ourselves a name. And so they decide that the title of the, if you would, almost protector of Japan, or more accurately, protector of the imperial family, is the Seitai Shogun, or you frequently shorten down to shogun. So the shogun is actually a term, it's a bureaucratic, label attached to the guy who's actually running Japan. He's not a member of the imperial family. Occasionally, what we'll see later is members of the shogunate, i.e., the Uji that are running Japan, will try to marry into the imperial family that they're going to sort of unify these powers. But as we'll see, that's not acceptable. In Japanese logic, those two have to stay separate. So what happens is, so you've got the shogun, who's actually running the country. You've got the imperial family / the emperor and his buddies, who are somewhere else under shogunate protection. The shogun doesn't want the imperial family to get involved in any politics. That's not, as far as he's concerned, their job is public relations. Their job is to look good, generate poetry, be stylish and sophisticated, and stay the hell out of its business. The imperial family doesn't always work that way, in the sense that occasionally you'll get emperors who really want to play the power game, but they invariably get their clock cleaned by the shogunate. So what happens is from basically the period when Nara is the quote imperial capital unquote, which is about 730, 740 AD or CE, right down to 1860s, the imperial family, i.e. the emperor and his family, live in particular locations. Nara and then Kyoto are the imperial capitals. Now, for much of that period, the shogunate, the Seitai shogun and his group, which is the group running Japan, live in entirely separate places. In fact, a classic example in the Tokugawa period is the Tokugawa shogunate is actually based in Edo, which is now Tokyo. The imperial court isn't even allowed to leave Kyoto. Any member of the imperial family or their entourage who tried to leave Kyoto, which is where the imperial palaces were, would be captured and probably executed on the spot by shogunate protective patrols, for lack of a better term. Because the Tokugawa sure didn't want the imperial family being involved in anything other than this sort of look good stuff. And so what you get is certainly by the Ashikaga period, by the 1300s, what happens is as these different families come to power, they more and more sort of formalize this idea of this, power control elite in contrast to the imperial elite. And so, among other things, what happens is in Japanese history, despite the fact that you get these various civil wars, is there are never wars for changing the social structure, never wars for changing the system, which is what the Chinese ones are. I mean, the Tang dynasty comes to power by virtue of changing the system. That's certainly true of the Ming. So, it's certainly true of the PRC in 1949. So you're changing the way things are done in China when you come to power. In Japan, all you're doing is you're changing the name on the front door. So what happens is no one wants to mess with how the system works. And so what happens is I would argue the system becomes more formalized as the polite for might say more fossilized. And you end up with an actual caste system. By the 1400s in Japan, you really have what is truly a caste system. And this is a term in anthropology, which is, if you're not familiar with it, basically says that whatever group you're born into is the group that you're going to live and die in. And the classic sort of, blunt way to phrase this is when someone's born, you can basically write their obituary because there's very little chance that life's going to be any different than the way it's set up at the beginning. Traditional Hindu society is probably the most famous modern example of the caste system. But the Japanese society right into the 1870s is at least as rigid, if not more rigid, than the Hindu one was. By the Tokugawa period, given the paranoia that the Tokugawas had, they were never sure they were the shogunate, but they were never sure they were going to keep it because, of course, they'd revolted against their own bosses less than 10 years earlier. So from 1600 to the 1860s, the Tokugawa shogunate is paranoid that they're going to lose control. It's going to slip out of their hands. So they actually totally fixed this to the extent that in all of Japan, if you were a peasant living in a village, in your entire existence, in fact, your entire family's existence, no one would probably be able to move more than 10 or 15 miles from the village without a written permission of whoever the shogunate's represented, whoever was the city manager, I guess, for lack of a better term, that you have, in charge of your place. The weirdest part of this, and again, it's very typical of the Japanese logic, since everything is defined by a group that has power keeping power. You don't really care how you screw up the larger system as long as you keep power. Now, this wasn't unique to Japan. The Chinese did this somewhat. I would argue that Xi Jinping and his current political policies are sort of example of the same thing. You don't really give a rat's ass what happens to China as long as your group stays in charge. Um, in Japan, what this means is, among other things, even though various governments have spent a fair amount of time developing decent road networks and bridges and stuff like that, the shogunate, the Tokugawas, when they come to power, actually destroy a lot of the road system. They mess it up. They destroy or at least partially break down a lot of the bridges. So they actually destroy their own internal transport infrastructure, which is you need for moving food around, for moving people around, for like a million different reasons. And then they intentionally get rid of it because they don't want anyone else to be able to move around the country freely. They want to make sure the only folks that can actually do that are the Tokugawa. So among other things, they completely control all technology. By the 1630, in other words, within 30 years of taking power, they completely closed down the society in the sense that no one outside of Japan is allowed to enter Japan. So prior to this, you'd have Korean merchants and Chinese merchants. This was true through all of Japanese history. Would come in usually through the Tsushima Strait region into Kyushu or northern southern Honshu, and they do deals and trade and stuff. And this was handy because this way the Japanese government kept up, on what was going on outside of Japan. The Tokugawas don't care. They're just like, F this. We don't care what the rest of the world's doing. Boom, we're going to shut the doors. And from that point on, any foreigners landing in Japan are usually executed on the spot. This eventually blows up in their face in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when the Europeans are expanding into China, and ships are running aground in Japan all the time, and they just they run aground and they expect at least some civility, and instead they get literally massacred at the side of the ship the minute they hit ground, which gets the Europeans all fused off. So what you find is you end up with this incredibly rigid social system. And the classic stereotype of this would be the 47 Ronin example, which we'll get into later, which is also a real famous story, which is not the same as that half-assed movie of about 10 years ago. Oh, jeez. Anyways, don't get me started. But nonetheless, in Japan, the 47 Ronin and this whole rigid social caste system become the way the world is until the late 19th century. Let's take a quick look at some of this. And here's Takayama again. We saw some images of that. That's a very large part of Takayama is still pretty old in the sense it goes back a couple hundred years. This is I guess for lack of a better term, this would be where the samurai who was the city manager, town manager, since Takayama was a pretty good sized town. This is where his base was. The chrysanthemum here is the classic image of that particular ruling uchi. So this particular structure, since it's actually a collection of structures, there'd be samurai wandering in and out. No one else would be allowed in around here even, unless they had some really good reason to be there. If you needed to leave Takayama and go to one of the little towns, 10 or 20 miles away, you'd have to come in here, go to the, samurai bureaucrats and basically tell them, I need a pass. Just like a military camp, you need a pass to get outside the camp for 5 days to go visit my auntie or something like that. And they would decide if they're going to give it to you or not. But this was a center of authority. There was no alternative to it. This was where these samurai hung out that not only managed but controlled Takayama. And everyone in that town was underneath them socially in a very rigid caste system that didn't change from generation to generation. Now, this is the Tokugawa headquarters. This is again in Tokyo. This is the castle that was the center of the Tokugawa power in Tokyo, which is then called Edo. Um, Given the technology at the time, it's not a particularly impressive structure. I mean, the Japanese already had cannon, they had muskets, so you sit up in here on the inside, you sit here and fire, you're going to get your butt blown off by someone outside here. So again, the power of this system was an image of the structure. So in that regard, it's sort of similar. If you remember, I showed you that one picture of the walls of the city of Xi'an in the Ming Dynasty. So it's the walls are making a statement. Now, in the Chinese system, the walls are making a statement between bureaucracy, centralized control in the Chinese state versus going out the gate, at which point you're in the never land of everything else. So the certainty of the Chinese world versus unpredictability of the world outside of China. In the Japanese sense, the inside is the samurai world, and the outside is the world where samurai can do whatever the hell they want to because there's no one's going to tell them no. Well, the classic example is if a samurai ended up with a new sword, if a swordsmith makes him a new sword, he has to test it. Now, traditionally, the way that you would test it would be with convicts. I mean, basically execute convicts by cutting them into pieces and then make sure the sword worked right. Now, if you don't have any convicts, for some reason it's Thursday and you don't have any convicts around, I can walk out with my new sword, walk down the street, find some locals who would be serfs or peasants, and I just use the sword on them. There's no consequences to that action because I'm a samurai and they're peasants, and their life is not even relevant in the way that I see the world. Now, even though the initial part of this is the Tokugawas, like all the rest of the Ujis who become political and come to shoguns, they come to power by virtue of their military power. This is the front gate to the castle. And again, it's beautifully done. This is all wrought iron, but it and bronze. But the interesting thing about this is it's not particularly functional in the sense that, again, one or two cannon could just blow the hell out of this thing with a couple of shots. But the key thing that's really important here is that it makes a statement. This is a symbolic statement of power, just like the imperial palaces in China. Your statement of power is the fact it's the people that are inside of this gate that would make you lose sleep at night, not the gate itself. The gate's just a way to sort of control people moving in and out. Now, what happens, not surprisingly, is these families come to power. So they gain political, military power, and they control Japan. Very quickly, what they then start doing is they sort of turn to the imperial family, which is sort of the only parallel I can think of would be maybe the idea of Paris. So, well, for the British, maybe the royal family. I don't know the British royal family has ever been famous for their style, but certainly in the French imperial court, but even just sort of Paris in general. If you want to have style in the rest of France, what you do is you go to Paris and check it out and see what they're doing that day. And you go and you copy it. In Japan, what happens is when the shogun gets set up, the new family the Uji comes to power, one of the first things they do is they want to look more sophisticated because most of these guys are just basically, they're military, in many cases, thugs. They've gained their position not by necessarily military prowess, but in many cases just by how many people they can kill. So these guys are bad boys. Their closest parallel would be maybe like a mafia sort of. So when they come to power, style and sophistication in most cases were absolutely nothing to do with what they had. They might have acquired some of that, but because they're busy trying to kill off all their competition, they don't have time to indulge in goofing around with things like the cha or the tea ceremony or something like that. So what happens when they finally do get power, then one of the first things they do is they jump on the idea of, hey, let's Gucci this place up. And so this is the gate, the inside gate. The outside gate was that one we saw just a second ago. This inside gate is the gate that actually leads to the imperial, or I should say the shogunate palace and the shogunate offices in their headquarters in Edo, Tokyo. If you notice, beautifully done, very gaudy. This is actually very typical of the shogunates, regardless of which of the shogunates they are. These guys weren't really big on style and sophistication because in most cases they just sort of bought it. So they'd be the equivalent of buying a $60,000 watch just because it's $60,000. It doesn't, they're not interested in whether it tells the time better, but they want to make sure that everyone knows the bugger costs 60 grand. So these guys are buying style. They're buying sophistication. They don't have it by virtue of birth or by virtue of education. They have it because they've acquired it literally at the point of a sword, or more accurately, the edge of a sword. So this is the Tokugawa sense of self that they want to portray when they've now become successful. Um, if you even think of the Chinese stuff, there certainly isn't the level of sophistication you see there. And that was, that's these guys didn't care. They were the guys running the system. They were the new players in charge. Keeping everyone else impressed was something they were good at, but it wasn't something they lost any sleep about. Now, having said that, of course, you also have the imperial family. So this is the imperial. This is still the big imperial palace in Kyoto. It's not the original one, but it was one of the three palaces. But it's the one that's still left. It's the imperial family hangs out when they're in Kyoto. They actually hang out in Kyoto a fair amount of the year. Let's see, it's what, early June. Well, they're probably back in Tokyo by now, but certainly in April and May, they tend to spend most of their time here in Kyoto. This is now part of what's called the Imperial Park, but the Imperial Park in the big center is a big honking, establishment. Now, if you notice, compared to the Tokugawa thing we just saw, it's a really different type of structure. It's a lot cleaner. It's a lot more, I suppose, for lack of a better term, subdued. It's militarily not even particularly useful. I mean, the walls have got, roofs on them. I mean, what the hell? That's not going to do any good. So this is obviously not military. It's a fence, if you would, but it's a fence of social status and prestige and ritual power, not a fence that's got a bunch of samurai marching around. In fact, you have very few armed guards inside. Almost all these samurai guarding, I use that in quotes, the imperial family, would actually be outside because there is much there to guard the world from the imperial family. In other words, make sure that these guys stay inside of here as they are to worry about outsiders coming in. In fact, when you think about it, there's almost no point in assassinating a Japanese emperor because what did that accomplish? They're not in charge of anything. They're just there for PR purposes. Assassinating a shogun was, on the other hand, a sort of like a recreational pursuit for some families. This is the whole logic of the quote ninja unquote. So what you have here is this is the imperial, and it's interesting when you look at it, how much more stylish, how much more sophisticated this is than its Tokugawa counterpart. Very little trim. The little trim here is all done here. It's all done in black lacquer and stuff. Very subdued. If you would, this is very much style and sophistication, understated elegance. Maybe that'd be the way to phrase it. And the Tokugawa is sort of like, look at me, I'm in charge. And so they're two different ways to look at everything. Now, you occasionally get sort of odd versions of all this because they had a lot of free time and actually had a lot of resources at hand. Some of the Japanese emperors would come up with pretty crazy structures. And this is Kinkakuji. This is it's actually a tea house. That's oftentimes called a palace. It's a tea house on a lake. Everything here is artificial. The walkway is artificial. The lake is artificial. This originally would have been probably rice fields. The rocks are all brought in. So everything you see here is man-made. Nothing here is natural. Even the trees are going to be largely brought in. All these trees are planted. Now, Kikakuji, I think, is about, I'm going to say 500 or 600 years old. The actual structure isn't. The actual structure gets burned down by an arsonist in the 1970s or 80s. I can't remember exactly who. It was some guy who just basically decided he didn't like anything about anything. So he just, burned the place down. They completely rebuilt it, I think, within 2 years. And it's exactly, since they had all the measurements and everything, it's basically a totally accurate reconstruction of the original. And this is gold leaf. I have no idea why the Japanese emperor decided he had to have the whole thing basically paneled in gold leaf. Now, it's not solid gold, it's just real thin gold leaf, but nonetheless, that's when you got way too much free time, and the emperors did. They weren't in charge of anything. They didn't have to worry about managing stuff. So they could just sort of goof around. They weren't like their Chinese counterparts. So the Kikakuji is a useful reminder of the power of status and ritual authority, but combined with that is basically these guys are like totally emasculated. They're not They're not in charge of anything. The Chinese would have no idea why this person would call themselves an emperor. To the Chinese and the Koreans also, that would make no sense. To the Tokugawas, it made perfect sense. You'd much rather have this guy screwing around, spending money, building a little structure like this, and keeping himself happy, because that means he's not going to even think about getting involved in things that his betters or adults are doing down the street, high-end in Edo. Oops, what happened here? Now, all this falls apart, like I said, by the mid late 19th century. The Europeans have come in. They've now got a bunch of trading ports. The Germans are about to get Tsingtao pretty soon. The British already have Hong Kong. The Americans have open trade on the Yangtze. The huge port of Canton, which was largely where the Europeans mainly hung out, and then of course later Shanghai, are already in business. And like I mentioned a minute ago, the Europeans more and more, since they have really lousy maps of this area, are constantly running aground in Japan, which if you remember those images isn't hard to do. And they're getting wiped out. They're not surprisingly getting a little pissed off about this. So they keep on trying to send what delegations, I guess, for lack of a better term, to the Japanese court to get them to stop, killing people like this, just sort of arbitrarily. Now, this doesn't work very well because what happens is when the delegations land, the Japanese kill them. It's sort of like this gets nowhere in a hurry. Eventually, the Europeans are getting really agitated. The Americans actually take the lead in this. A large number of the Americans by now were the huge whalers in the West. This is a huge thing, of course, here in Hawaii. And by the 1840s, whaling ships, which were not necessarily particularly well managed, are running aground everywhere, and tons of them are running aground in Japan. Of course, they all get whacked. And so what happens is those merchants and the owners then complain to the American government, "Hey, you guys got to do something about this brutality," da, 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 da. And so what happens is the American government, I'm not sure why they decided to pick this fight. They just finished the war with Mexico, maybe that's why. So what happens is they actually send a squadron to Japan to tell the Japanese, you got to cut this crap out. Under a Commodore Perry. These become called, in Japan, these are called the Black Ships or the Black Ship Squadron. And there's a bunch of images in Japan of that squadron. This was a seminal event in Japan for a bunch of reasons, about half of which has something to do with the ships. Perry was a clever choice. I think he stops in Hong Kong. He stops somewhere. I think I'm going to say Hong Kong. I'm not sure. He stops somewhere first and picks up some old boats, old fishing boats, sails into Yokohama Harbor, which is the harbor port area of Edo, Tokyo. Somewhere along the line, he got enough background. Probably the Dutch are allowed one ship into Nagasaki. We don't have time to get into the whole Dutch and the Nagasaki thing, but the Dutch are allowed one ship into Nagasaki. So the outsiders have some idea how Japan operates. And Perry realizes, already knows that talking to the imperial family, i.e. the emperor's a waste of time because he's not in charge of anything. So he very quickly realized, okay, if you want to get anything done, you got to talk to the shogun. So he sails up to Edo, tells the shogun, okay, you got to cut this crap out. You can't go around whacking people like this. And of course, the shogun refuses to deal with him. So what he does is he takes these boats that he brought up and blows the absolute crap out of them with his guns. Now, because the shogunate had controlled all technology, Japanese had cannon, but the cannon from like 1600. So, the period of the Spanish trying to invade England and stuff like that. So, basically, their cannon, their military date from the same period as the British and the French and the Spanish coming to the New World. They have skipped the other, by then, 200 plus years of military technological advances. So when Perry shows up, his ships are steamships. They've got these enormous cannon that can fire for miles, and he's got muskets and all sorts of stuff like that. And so very quickly, you have to remember, somehow the shogunate doesn't want to deal with this stuff. On the other hand, these guys originally were military and they're very paranoid about keeping control. And they realize they came to power by virtue of their military power. They take one look at those American ships and they go, we're screwed. They have nothing that can deal with that. And so they very quickly, at least superficially capitulate and start to do, okay, Americans can come here and then the Brits can come here and won't kill you guys and da 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 da. Now, having said that, different uji or different families within the shogunate government don't buy into that. So I think within a year the British, I don't know if he was a foreign, well, I guess he was technically a foreign minister, whoever the British ambassador was to Japan. He's just walking down the street with a couple of assistants, and a group of samurai come out and just whack him. I think the French minister, I think, was also killed within a year. And when the British go to the shogun, they're going, hey, you guys, we did a deal. We're supposed to be able to be here. And the shogun goes, well, yeah, I'm sorry. It's Friday and we weren't keeping track. And these folks really aren't under our control. And the British and the French and their governments, even the Chinese, are still like rolling their eyes, going, "What the hell you mean they're not under your control? You're in charge. What the hell's going on?" And what they weren't really understanding is this was a manifestation of the fact that the shogunates were actually being accurate. They weren't in control anymore. This becomes classic in 1864 when the southern warlord, I believe it's the Satsumas, I can't remember which, I think it was Satsumas in charge of that fort. That particular uji or clan decides they've had enough of the Europeans, they want them out. They want to go back to the old ways, if you would. So they actually massacre the crew of a ship that's landed for some reason, in their area. The British and the French get together and basically say, you can't do that crap anymore. And the don't even call it Satsumas basically say, make us, up yours. And so what happens is they cluster in this fort, this big, spectacular fort, sort of like the Tokugawa one we saw the image of. The British and the French ships stay offshore and blow the bejesus out of the fort. I think the estimates are the samurai suffered between 3,000 and 6,000 casualties. The British and the French, I think, had 3 dead and 16 wounded because one or two of their cannon actually blew up on them. But that was the only. I mean, the shogunate forces didn't hit a person. It was a massacre. It wasn't a fight. Why it was such an important event wasn't so much the death toll. It was the fact that all of a sudden, you have to remember, for the last 1,500 years, the samurai were your military elite. They were the guys that grew up learning how to kill people, and they were really good at it. But it was in this very strict, very rigid system. Just like, if you want to look at a modern version of rigid Japanese logic, watch sumo, which is absolutely fascinating when you realize what the rules are like. But it's the same thing. Everything's so rigid and so constrained, and there's so many rules about what you can do and when you can do it and why you can do it, that it's a dance. It's like a minuet or something. It's a very formal thing. And what had happened is the samurai system had become this very formal thing. It really wasn't based on, in a really blunt way, it wasn't really based on efficiently killing people anymore. It was like killing people with a particular style to reinforce who you were. The same reason that the knights disappeared in the 1600s in Europe, because their way of doing stuff wasn't very good at killing people anymore. It was only very good at reminding everyone what a knight was. So what happens is this Battle of Shimonoseki is important because what it basically points out to everyone, both the common population, but also all the other samurai, and even especially the shogunate, is that samurai were basically they were like decorative pieces. The only time you're gonna see them really after that being useful is in modern movies. After Shimonoseki, they're an adjunct. When the two revolutions, there's various internal fights that you have, the Civil War. What you find is invariably the samurai get massacred by new troops, which are using modern European weapons, just literally blow them out of the ground. There's some really bad. God, what's his name? There's some really bad, again, very typical in movies about Asia, is what you find. There's some European guy that comes in and somehow becomes the centerpiece of the hero of the whole thing, even though he didn't exist in the Japanese system at all. Trying to total blank. Anyways, so there's a couple of Western movies about this Civil War period. They're all incredibly bad, and in Japan, I assume people watch them basically get a good laugh. But what happens is very quickly after this battle of Shimonoseki is the shogunate totally collapses. None of the other warlords, I should say, leaders in other parts of Japan, the other uji, see any reason they should back the shogunate anymore, because the shogunate couldn't get rid of the black ships. The shogunate just got their butts handed to them, the Shimonoseki. So, why have guys that are supposed to be your power brokers when they don't have any power, they're not brokers anymore. Um, Now, when the dust sort of settles on all this, you end up with, ironically, for the first time in probably at least 1,300 years, you end up with the Japanese emperor, the guy in Kyoto, who suddenly steps up and says, okay, enough of this crap. The shogunate is a waste of time. The shogunate doesn't work anymore, which was true. So he's going to replace and put himself back in power. So he's going to become a Chinese emperor, if you would. He's going to be the ritual guy, but he's also now going to be the political social power in Japan. And he does that for about maybe 10 years. By the time he's in his 50s, you've already got a group of advisors again. Just like they're not called the shogunate anymore. Now they're a collection. They're not an uji anymore. Now they're just a collection of what is called the genro, senior statesmen. Now, in one way, shape, or form, this group still exists in Japan. This is the group that gets Japan involved in China. This is the group that gets Japan involved in making World War II happen. This is the group that's been involved in Japan ever since then in terms of, post World War II. Who the guys are changes. So it's not the same group of people. So it's not like a political party or something like that. But what you have is within 10 years, the Meiji actually coming to power and being sort of the political, social, ritual force in Japan. He gets sort of demoted back to being a ritual head. And these group of senior statesmen now become the de facto rulers of the state. And that's the Japanese system down till today. So what you find is again, as before, it's a power elite. The only difference is the power elite doesn't wear armor. They don't have swords. They're not samurai. Now they're financial elites. They're Mitsubishi. Sites of it. You ever go and Wikipedia Mitsubishi in terms of just exactly what that company's involved in? It's mind blowing. So what you get is this small group of very powerful statesmen who run the system, and they make alliances between different members of them and different groups. One group aligns itself with the army, for example, and that's the nightmare that Japan finds itself in the first half of the 20th century. And so all this is going on, but the emperor very quickly is again, harmless. This is certainly true in the Hirohito period when he becomes emperor, I believe in the 20s. I can't remember when his dad passed away. So, in World War II stuff, you had the Japanese emperor, and people will oftentimes wonder at the end of World War II, why didn't they get rid of the emperor? Well, that's because, for all his other faults, MacArthur was very aware of how power functioned. And he realized very quickly that one, the emperor was the ritual head of Japan. He was closer to a pope than he was a political leader. So you were going to cause a huge amount of trouble with the Japanese population if you got rid of him. Secondly, keeping him in power really didn't do anything because he probably never made a decision. I think the only decision you can actually say he made, again, this with advice, was the idea of getting out of World War II, of surrendering, which apparently he did. But again, he still had two senior statesmen advising him as this is the thing to do. So I'm not sure, I'm not to be negative on Hirohito, but I'm not sure if he ever actually made a choice of his own. I'm not ever sure if he made his own decision. In this regard, he's like the absolute opposite of the Chinese emperors, who are almost always decision makers. Frequently the wrong decision, but they made the calls. So what you have is sort of finish off with the history part. Is you end up in the late 19th century, the Japanese. In fact, the other thing the black ships do is again the Japanese are aware of what's going on around outside of them again because of the touch of Nagasaki. So they're very aware that China is getting taken apart like a piece of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And they're adamant that isn't going to happen to them. When Shimonoseki happens, they're realizing they absolutely got the squat they can do about it. If the Europeans and the Americans decide they want to come in and take over Japan, yeah, everyone could fight them, but they're going to lose. They're just going to get massacred by the Europeans. So the Japanese come to an interesting conclusion. This is, again, your senior statesman. They decide that basically you can't fight the Europeans like the Chinese are trying to do or like the Koreans eventually try to do. What you're going to have to do is you're going to actually copy them. So what the Japanese do is they set themselves up by the 1870s to basically become the best Europeans they can become. So they spend enormous amounts of their resources building up an army, building up a navy, and it's state of the art. They send their naval office, the samurai, the senior samurai who are in charge of, marine stuff or maritime stuff. They send them to England to be trained into running a modern navy. they send the army officers, again, the army samurai, to Germany and to France to learn how to be army officers. So they basically say, okay, the Europeans are better than us at this stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy them, but not copy them to be like them. We're going to copy them to be better than they are. Their success is such that even in 1875, I can't remember when the last part of the Civil War was. That happens up in in Hokkaido. Anyways, but anyways, when the dust settles, I'm going to say early mid 1870s. Within roughly 15, maybe 20 years, the Japanese go to war with China, which is, their army is like, probably 15 times the size of the Japanese. And it's actually got in many cases modern weapons and such like that. The Japanese just kick their butt. The Japanese Navy wipes out the Chinese Navy. The Japanese army just beats the crap out of the Chinese army. And at the end of this, they end up taking over Taiwan, which was called Formosa at the time, along with other Chinese territories. Now, the Europeans, of course, are so racist that no one really pays much attention to this because they just see these are two Asian groups fighting each other. The Japanese are fighting the Chinese. Okay, the Japanese well, fine. That's just Asians beating Asians. What, who cares, right? 1898, there's the Boxer Revolution or the Boxer Revolt. The Japanese become one of the major players in that, along with the Russians. And Europeans start to take a little more notice of the fact that the Japanese are actually really good at killing people. And the Japanese army looks exactly like a European army. The Japanese Navy by 1898 is it makes the Europeans think because the European navies are all, of course, based in Europe. They've only got a few ships out in Asia because that's marginal. That's the fringe, right? And so they realized very quickly if they had pissed off the Japanese could take them out too. Eventually, the Europeans would, ship ships over and win, but it wasn't a given anymore. The Japanese weren't the Chinese and speaking a different language. There's obviously a different game being played, but it's still no one's taking this seriously. Least seriously are the Russians. Imperial Russia has long since taken. They've had Siberia for a couple hundred years by then. They decided what they want to do is they want to move down and take over northern China. They moved down into Manchuria and stuff like that, which they took over in part in 1898, then the Boxer Revolt. And then we keep on moving south. The Japanese have decided that it's not enough to look like the Europeans in terms of having a military. You have to use your military like the Europeans. So the Japanese set themselves up. In fact, with the Chinese war, their main reason for fighting the Chinese was to take over Chinese territory. They figure if it's good enough for the British, the French, the Germans, and the Russians and everyone else, hell, it's good enough for us. And the Chinese are the easiest ones to pick on. So not surprisingly, by the early 20th century, the Russians moving down, the Japanese moving up the Korean Peninsula and Manchuria run into each other. The Russians being Russians, Russian history, Russian society was, and I would argue still is, incredibly ethnocentric. And they're incredibly racist. And they certainly are, everyone was, I would argue. All the Europeans and Americans were incredibly racist at the turn of the 20th century. So when the Japanese start giving them attitude about you can't go down here because this is ours, the Russians are just rolling it ours, thinking, what the hell? What do you think you're going to tell us to do? So they and the Japanese get into it in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. And the Japanese shocked the absolute crap out of everyone. Within less than a year and a half, they destroyed 2 Russian navies. They destroyed all the Russian navies, the Navy in Asia and also then the Navy that comes over from Europe. They wipe them both out. They wipe out the Navy to Europe. I think it was like out of 60-some ships, only 4 managed to make it to a harbor. Everything else either surrenders or gets sunk. There's been nothing like it in history that I know of in the last couple of hundred years in terms of, if you're going to beat someone's clock, this is how you do it. They're outnumbered by Russian military and the army. They take it to them, and they take over large chunks of southern Siberia. They take over all the Russian area and Korea and Manchuria. And they're basically getting ready to, suck up the rest of Siberia and Manchuria when the Russians finally basically, to all intents and purposes, surrender. And this happens in less than a year and a half. The Europeans and the Americans are stunned because the Russians, to the Western European attitude, Russians really aren't totally Europeans. They still aren't seen that way today. the way the Ukrainian-Russian war is phrased is very much what they do. The Ukrainians are more European-like, and the Russians are more, I don't know what you call it, Asian-like. I don't know, for lack of a better term. But certainly back in the early 20th century, the Russians were seen as having a huge army. It had been very successful in like the Napoleonic Wars and stuff, but they weren't really seen as being quote as good unquote as say the Germans or the French or the British or something like that. Having said that, they were still considered better than anyone else on the planet, and that includes the Americans. So when the Russians get their clock cleaned in less than a year and a half by the Japanese, who everyone sort of thought was, it's probably like a Trivial Pursuit contest. Where's Japan? Most folks probably couldn't answer. All of a sudden, now the Japanese won a major war against a major European power, and they've done it more decisively than any other war probably in the last 300 or 400 years. And everyone's going like, "Holy crap! What had just happened?" The Americans, much to the Japanese irritation, threatened them with a British, French, American embargo and military action. And so the Japanese back off and give up most of the territory they've taken from the Russians. But there's a real bad taste in their mouth about that because they want it. They have their own blood they want it. And they don't see any reason they should give it up just because some guys that are living thousands of miles away, who have a boatload of attitude about their superiority, are telling them, well, you can't keep it. So the Japanese don't forget that. In 1910, they intentionally destabilized Korea, and then they take over Korea. This time, there isn't an agreement among the Euro-Americans in terms of what they're going to do about it. So just sort of that de facto takes place. 1914, the Japanese immediately jump on the British bandwagon. And so what they do is they could take over the German colonies in Asia, which is, largely Tsingtao, the German colonies of China. They also, this becomes really a key factor for us, is they take over Micronesia, which was all German. So almost all of Micronesia was originally German colonies. Well, the Japanese take those over with the exception of Guam, which the Americans took from the Spanish. So most of Micronesia now becomes Japanese territory because they take it over from the Germans. And at that point, again, World War I being what it is, no one really cares that much because the Pacific is such a marginal area to the what makes the Europeans get excited. The Americans get sort of excited, but the Americans, again, are still focused on Europe also. I should point out the Americans don't join World War I until 1917. So by that time, the Japanese have already been part of the war for near on 3 years. The Japanese are doing their own thing. Now, what happens at the end of World War I is the Japanese want to take over other parts of Asia that the Germans had some interest in. And they get told no. Again, the British and the French and the Americans basically tell the Japanese, no, you can't have that. The British and the French and the Americans are very good at taking it for themselves. They don't want the Japanese to have it. They also tell the Japanese you can't have the same size military, specifically Navy, that we have. So the Japanese leave World War I even a worse taste in their mouth than they did after the Russo-Japanese War. This is sort of like, by then it's become very clear to them, it doesn't matter how good they are technologically, it doesn't matter how good their military is, which they apparently sort of thought would be at some point, given that they come from an entirely different background, I think they knew intuitively that the British and folks and the Americans and stuff were entirely racist and totally ethnocentric. But I think their attitude was, if we have a good enough military and we can prove as we're good as these guys, the least accept as sort of like part equals. And post World War I, it becomes very, very clear that's not the case. In the United States, especially, anti-Japanese feeling starts to really pick up. It had been anti-Chinese feeling, and it morphs into anti-Asian. The Yellow Peril movement thing by the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. By the early 20th century, it shifts to more of an anti-Japanese focus. And so the Japanese are realizing that not only are your other governments not going to accept them as equals, but to the populations in those places, especially the United States, the Japanese are barely human. The term right into the late World War II propaganda period was the idea of yellow monkey, which is the idea that this originally was a term given to the Chinese, but by the early 20th century, this becomes the Japanese. And there's all this PR that basically says, well, the Japanese beat the Russians because they were tricky, or who knows what the silly logic was. But the end result is the Japanese realize collectively that they're always going to be second best. and they decided, screw that. That's not the way it's going to be. They are successes. They've been successes. They haven't lost a war. In fact, I think they might have not even lost a battle since, maybe 1894. So they're not, they don't see any reason they should kowtow to what a bunch of outsiders say. And again, what happens is a group of these senior advisors becomes tied into the military. More accurately, they get tied into a group of officers that are younger officers. Now, just serve as a quick segue out of this, the samurai by the late, I can't remember the date, I'm going to say 1883, but that's probably not right. Somewhere during the Meiji's reign, he makes the samurai, I don't know what it's not that he makes it illegal. He makes carrying the two swords illegal. And he basically says samurai don't have special status anymore. Now he sort of, again, he's doing this with the senior advisors because I think rather cynically, again, almost like the first emperor in China, the Meiji's thinking, well, if you leave these guys walking around thinking they're in charge, eventually they're going to do something to the first emperor's family, put them back in Kyoto, and there's going to be a new shogun. So he decides he's going to short circuit that by getting rid of this whole shogunate system. And the way you do that is by getting rid of the idea of samurai elites. Now, having done that, they very cleverly realized you really can't get rid of the samurai. One, there's too many of them. They're almost 10% of the population. And secondly, if you do, there's going to be an enormous class war going on in Japan. So what they do is they basically distract the samurai. They go into them, they start to say, like, put a hand around the shoulder and go, hey, you guys are by far the best soldiers we've got. You know more about this. You've had centuries of, knowing how to really kill people really well. And we need that. What we're going to do is we're going to make you the officer corps. So in both the Japanese Navy, but especially the Japanese Army, what happens is the officer corps for the Army especially is entirely samurai. And so it's a clever move, and it actually sort of works in the sense that the samurai now buy into the idea of the new Japanese state because they've still got power. Now it's just power in this new modernized, westernized military. And they're still going around whacking people with the Chinese, the Koreans, or whoever. So, that's cool. They got something to do. And they've still got status and prestige. It's not the same quite. But this is why, if you look at the Japanese officer corps right into the end of World War II, they're carrying swords. That's a reminder of their samurai status, even though they technically weren't samurai anymore. You still learn how to use a sword in Japanese military academies. They still see the code of Bushido as being central. They just now call it the Emperor's Worship. And so what happens is in many ways, nothing changes. You just change where these folks are. And again, that's more likely to happen in Japan because the Japanese system was always based on residents and networks. So if you find a new network for these samurai to hang out in, they're going to be cool with that because that's always the way they'd seen the world. This is the new network they're a part of. The downside of that is that just like all the other times in Japanese history, is different folks in authority will do relationships with different clumps of folks in these networks. And so what happens is one of these networks is officers, in the military from the collection largely ranks from captain up to maybe colonel, but largely captains and majors in the Japanese army of the 1920s, which is this post-World War I army, and becomes really fixated on the fact that they'd been screwed over by the Europeans, Americans in terms of what they got after World War I. And there are now all these new rules about what you can't have that the Americans and Europeans don't follow, but that tell the Japanese, well, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so these young officers, with support from some of these senior statesmen who are now running Japan, basically decide that, well, they don't see any particular reason why they should put up with European American nonsense. And so what happens is you end up rather spectacularly with a whole series of, they're not really revolts. They're like again, the closest thing I can think of would be like a mafia where you're clearing out part of the old branches of the family. So what happened is the young officers actually don't tell their generals in charge, and they don't tell the government in Japan, although some of these senior guys do. And what they do is they invade Manchuria. So literally parts of the Japanese army go rogue and invade Manchuria on their own in 1931. And they very quickly take over, large chunks of Manchuria, in part simply because the Chinese, one, are so disorganized, and two, because the Chinese don't have any clue anything's going on because there was no declaration of war. The Japanese government isn't saying anything. All of a sudden, it's like you wake up on Tuesday and here's the Japanese army on your doorstep, killing folks and invading. Um, and once they start to make gains, then these officers actually tell their generals, "Oh, by the way, yeah, yesterday, yeah, the reason you couldn't find anyone around is because you invaded Manchuria." And then the generals and these guys then tell the government in Japan, "Yeah, oh, by the way, the reason everyone's getting all upset was we just invaded Manchuria yesterday, so you might want to, phone with the British ambassador and let him know." And the government's just, mortified because, they don't know what the hell's going on. But you end up with, ego being ego, and this be true of any government. The last thing you're going to do is tell outsiders, in other words, the British, the Americans, the French, whoever, that you don't even have control of your own military. And even more terrifying, if you're the government, your generals don't have control of their own units. These guys are literally going rogue, at the level of regiments or battalions or whatever. Um, and so everyone just sort of says, okay, well, and everyone sort of says, don't do that again. But almost all these guys get promoted because one of the other things they were doing is a very Japanese thing. Chinese don't do. I've never heard of Chinese or Koreans doing this, but Japanese, this is a real typical way of doing stuff, at least in Japanese history, but also especially with the Japanese military. So I was doing some work on the Japanese in Luzon in 1944, 45, and this is real common. Um, in the Japanese system, if you're part of this uji, you're part of this group of relationships, this group hanging out together. You might not be of highest rank, but of course your allegiance is to your boss, i.e., the guy in charge of your group. Now, where the Japanese become sort of different about this, well, very different about this, is in the Japanese system, I can be a captain, we'll say, in the Japanese army. And my boss, i.e., the general in charge of my unit, is sort of like, well, no, we shouldn't do this. This is a bad idea. And so my attitude is very likely going to be, if I think it's a good idea, I can actually kill my general. Now, mind you, he's my boss. He's the guy in charge. He's the guy I swore allegiance to. But my logic's going to be, well, he's making a bad decision. I've told him, in public and in private, this is a bad choice. You've got to go ahead and do this. He's going like, no, it's a bad idea. I'm not going to do it. And at that point, you've got to actually take into, my view is if someone asks me, I'm going to say, well, I'm sorry, I have to kill him because he's making the wrong decision. And eventually in history, they're going to look back and point back to him and say, this was a stupid thing to do and he should have never done it. He should have done what the officers told him to do. So what happens is you end up, the idea of killing people for their own good becomes an integral part. It was part of the Japanese military logic for hundreds of years prior to this, but especially in the Japanese military from 1931 to 1945, it becomes really common. In the groups that I studied, the two divisions I studied that were fighting in northern part of Luzon in 1944-45, there were 3 generals that were killed, 4 colonels that were killed, and I can't remember how many majors that died at the hands of their own younger officers. So it's literally, we're having a meeting and the guy in charge saying, no, this is a bad idea. We can't do it. I'm forbid it. And I literally just pull out my gun and just boom, I just blow his ass off right there on the spot. That's my boss. Now, in any other army, what would happen is immediately someone else would blow my ass off because I just killed the commanding officer. In the Japanese system, everyone's sort of like, well, too bad, so sad. So it's killing people for their own good becomes part and parcel of the Japanese logic. Now, you see this in 1936 with the Young Officers Movement, where a group of officers, again, these younger guys, sponsored again by 2 of the senior statesmen, actually go on a rampage. They kill the foreign minister, the interior minister. I think they wound the prime minister. I can never remember. And they whack 3 or 4 generals. All this is happening in Tokyo. So it's literally, Friday morning in Tokyo, and all of a sudden this group of military guys shows up, machine guns, soldiers under command of their captains or whoever, and they just start whacking guys. They go up to the foreign minister and the interior minister's house, and they literally, he's getting in his car to go to work. They just blow his ass off right there. And I think they kill his entire family right there on the spot. And all the phrase is the same. These folks were making bad decisions. They were going to embarrass Japan. They were going to make Japan a second-rate power when we deserve to be better. And so you've got to kill them before they make too many bad choices. I suppose, for lack of a term, you'd have to call it sort of internal assassinations. I'm not sure if there's a technical term for it. Anyways, that becomes modus operandi in the Japanese military. Now, what that means is that sets an enormous amount of paralysis in the senior military and the government. You can imagine the American government right now, suddenly some junior officers start killing senior officers and members of the current administration, before they make some bad decisions. So you're sort of saying they've made bad decisions. You're saying they're going to make bad decisions, but you're not necessarily specifying what. So this isn't a political movement in the sense of we want social change, we want voting rights for minorities or whatever it might be. There's no there's no social logic couched to it. It's just a group of people who think another group of people are working against their own best interest. And so what this means is if you're any member of the administration and or senior member of the military from 1936 through the end of World War II, 1945, the chance of getting killed by your own military is probably a hell of a lot better than getting killed by the Chinese or the Americans or the Brits or whoever. Um, yeah, it's a trip. The Japanese military, I've never figured out how they functioned at all. When if you're the guy in charge, it's not enough to get people. You have to sell the folks underneath you that you've got a better idea, but you're not necessarily. You might be their boss, in terms of a military structure, but you're not necessarily their emotional Uji boss. That might be somebody else. And this, I think, was a source of huge confusion for especially the Americans right through near to the end of the war, because they could never figure out why things were happening. When the kamikazes come to into effect in 1944, where you get pilots diving into American ships or even running into American airplanes rather than trying to shoot them down. This wasn't done. This wasn't sponsored by the central government. This was leaders of fighter squadrons and bomber squadrons of airplanes, unilaterally on their own, saying this is a good thing to do. This is better than the alternatives. And in many cases, their superiors were like, "What? We just spent 6 months training this guy how to fly an airplane. You're going to crash him into a boat? That's a total waste of manpower and skill." And these guys are like, "Well, you just don't know," and they do it. And then it becomes a larger and larger thing, and the kamikazes become a Japanese phenomenon. I suppose they were, but it wasn't a collectively decided phenomenon. It was decided by a small minority group who basically gets everyone else afraid of what if you try to oppose these guys, what's going to happen to you? And the general attitude is where you're going to end up 6 feet in the ground. So 1937, the Japanese invaded China again. This again is a group of young officers. It's a hugely embarrassing and disastrous situation for the Japanese government because the Manchurian army, the Japanese army in northern China, invades Japan. No declaration of war, no nothing. They also don't tell their own government. The Japanese government finds out when the British foreign minister and the Chinese call up the Japanese government and say, why are you attacking us? And the Japanese government say, what? Did you have too much to drink last night? What's going on? They're like, no, you're invading China. And they didn't know. They had to find out from foreigners that their military was attacking a foreign government. Absolutely insane, because this is the start of World War II, 1937. But it says something about the fact that there was no collective agreement that you had to do this. It wasn't like the Germans invading Poland or the Germans invading Russia or something like that, where there's a collective agreement. In this case, it's literally a small, almost splinter group in most cases deciding what's going to happen. The entire government, entire society being dragged in behind them, because you can't admit to everyone else that you're parts of your military just decide hell, let's do this. Why not? So that's Japan in the first half of the 20th century. It's like structured anarchy, for lack of a better term. 1941, the China mess has gotten worse and worse and worse because the Japanese government really didn't, plan on attacking China that way. They really had no plan on, one, what to do when they took it over, which is what they thought was going to happen, and two, they had no way to really deal effectively with the fallout because since they hadn't planned on attacking China, they didn't know how to deal with the foreign reaction to it, which was stunningly negative, not surprisingly. So pretty soon everything's embargoed. No oil's allowed in, no this, no that. And at that point, then the Japanese collectively, as a group, have to invade, the Europeans, i.e. the Europeans in Asia, the United States / the Americans, Pearl Harbor, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the expansion of World War II from China to everyone else is a part of that. 1945, the Japanese lose the war. It's important to remember that there were sort of three things behind the Japanese decided they had to quit. One was the firebombing. By mid 1945, no large Japanese city existed anymore. They had all been burned out. 60 to 70% of Tokyo, 80% of Nagoya, 70 something percent of Osaka. All the Japanese cities have been completely gutted. Um, Millions of people had died in these firestorms. So there literally was, the urban population had ceased to exist for any city over probably maybe 50,000 people. The Americans were actually to cut back attacks because they didn't have anything to burn anymore. So you have that. You have the nuclear weapons coming in, but that's an American thing. The Americans are the ones who get so freaked out about the idea of nuclear weapons, and they ended the war. Nuclear weapons didn't end the war. The firebomb attacks ended the war a lot more than the nuclear weapons. But the other thing that ended the war, which Americans would totally ignore because it's not part of the American mythos, is the Russians decided to switch sides. The Soviets, who had actually been neutral with the Japanese, ironically, after the Soviets come to power in 1911, they and the Japanese get along okay. They don't like each other, but they put up with each other. When Japan goes to war with China, they get the Soviets to agree that the Soviets aren't going to attack, so Russia stays out of it. 1943-44, the Americans especially, but also the Brits, are pressuring the Soviets to go after Japan since Japan's part of this triumvirate. And the Soviets are like, well, we will when we're ready. But not surprising, the Soviet focus was entirely on getting rid of Nazi Germany. But it says something again to the power that the Soviet military had, which sort of again gets very little play in the West. They ship a large chunk of the Soviet military, which had been fighting in Germany, literally weeks later, going over, was it 2,800 miles of railroad, something insane like that. They railroad them by trains, basically take them from Eastern Germany all the way across through Siberia to the eastern part of Siberia, and then declare war on Japan and invade Japan, in the space of a couple of months. And within 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I can't remember exactly what, they not only take over all of Manchuria, they take over the northern half of Korea. They're taking over, they're moving into northern China real quickly. And most terrifying to the Japanese is they've taken over the Sakhalins, those north, remember the image of the Japanese islands, the northern islands off of Siberia, they've taken all of those real quickly. And they've moved in, they're getting ready to invade Hokkaido. In fact, they're within a week of invading Hokkaido. Now, the Soviet attitude towards the Japanese, I'm not particularly sure why. I think, well, that was a Soviet attitude towards anyone. Soviet attitude towards anyone in World War II was sort of like, if you're shooting at us, we're going to kill you. So they basically took no prisoners in Sakhalins. When they invaded the Sakhalin Islands, which was Japanese property, they just basically killed everyone. And they had actually formally told the Japanese, when we invade Hokkaido, it's going to take us about 2 weeks to take it, which probably is about right. They probably could have done it in a couple of weeks, given what they'd already done. And they also told the Japanese, when we're done, there aren't going to be Japanese left on Hokkaido. We're going to erase the Japanese population from Hokkaido. It's going to become Soviet territory. And then we're going to move to North Honshu. So the Soviets made it very, very clear that they were just going to basically start working their way down the Japanese islands, killing everyone as they went. This had more to do with the Japanese surrender in 1945 than the nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were largely localized. Yeah, you're going to lose, maybe 20 miles or something like that. But to be honest, most of the cities were gone. So, one of the problems in a sad, sort of freaky way is the Americans had a hard time figuring out targets for nuclear bombs. What were we going to blow up that was worth blowing up? All the Japanese naval bases were gone. All the Japanese military bases were pretty much wiped out. The Japanese cities were wiped out. What were you going to blow up that anyone was going to care about? On the other hand, the Soviets are killing everything. They're salting the earth, as it were. And so what happens is the Japanese go, well, listen, we're not going to win this one. They surrender. MacArthur is brought in. The Soviets, once they kept the Sakhalins, they realized they aren't going to get any more. By then, the Cold War, within weeks of World War II ending, the Cold War already starts up. Stalin was so paranoid about the Europeans, especially the Brits, and the Americans, especially the Brits, are even more paranoid about the Soviets. So, sort of like World War II it sort of ends like a timeout, like there's going to be another war. And so what happens in that is that during the occupation, which is largely American, but with some British support, the Americans take over the Japanese islands and basically put them under new management. MacArthur is put in position of authority of managing the Japanese, pseudo government under the Americans. And he does several things. One is, like I mentioned, he keeps the emperor in charge because he realizes that getting rid of him going to cause a lot of unrest. It's not going to do anything. Um, he also, his fear of the Chinese communist, which was nigh on paranoia, means that he is willing to actually let a lot of the things the Japanese did in World War II period slide because he wants to make sure that there's enough left of Japan that when as far as he was concerned, when the war with the Chinese starts, that the Japanese will stay on the American side. And so what happens is, in a weird way, unlike the Germans or even the Italians for that matter, especially the Germans had to go through this huge apologies for World War II. There were the Nuremberg trials. The Germans weren't allowed to reunify. They weren't allowed to this, that, and the other thing. In fact, right into the 1970s. In fact, Germans were still apologizing for stuff into the 1980s, 40 years later. The Japanese are never made to apologize for anything they did in the 20th century. The huge genocide they did, they killed tens of millions of Chinese at a minimum, if not more than that. They never have to apologize for it. They never have to do compensation for it. They never have to owe up for the staggering brutality. And they were much better at genocide than the Germans were. Japanese made it into an art form. They never had to apologize for the wars that they started in Asia, especially against the Chinese and the Koreans for that matter. They wipe out maybe 30 to 40% of the Korean population just because. And so what happens is Japan never actually faces the consequences of its actions in the first half of the 20th century in the second half. And what this means in a rather weird way is the Japanese then are able to sort of spin what World War II was and what World War II meant to them in a very different way than the Europeans can, specifically the Germans, but also the Italians. And this has enormous consequences right down till today. One of the side effects of this means that the Chinese, the Koreans, and all the other folks in Asia that had been at the forefront of getting wiped out by the Japanese freak out because no one ever makes the Japanese apologize. And the Japanese aren't going to go and apologize unless they have to. So when the Japanese start to rearm and become a political power in the 1970s, 1980s, the Chinese, the Koreans, everyone else start to freak out because what they see is this is just a resurgence of the Japanese empire. As far as everyone else is concerned, this is 1931 all over again. This is something the current administration now in 2026 has just changed the Japanese constitution. So the Japanese, for the first time, are able to sell military weapons. They're able to have military units go outside of Japan. After World War II, they're basically self-defense forces. They can only protect Japanese islands from external influences. Now they're just like every other military, any other political group in the world. This is something that's got the Chinese especially really freaked out, in part just because the Japanese have a very efficient, in many ways, military, but also because with Xi Jinping and his attitude, the Chinese sort of being da-da-da-da-da, the Japanese, by virtue of their history in Asia, are the last people you want to piss off, because once you piss off the Japanese, they don't care how it ends as long as everyone's dead. And that's how they've always played the game. They don't play the game with winners and losers. They play the game with winners and dead folks. And Xi Jinping, I don't think really has grasped this. I don't think it's the same in Japan, of course, in any ways. But I don't think the rest of Asia realize how the Japanese can just get deadly serious about stuff. And so, and what this does, if you're Thai or Vietnamese or Korean, you're not sure who freaks you out most, the Chinese because they're being so aggressive for no particular reason, or the Japanese because also the Japanese are now rearming at an incredible rate. And the Japanese have a history of causing trouble, even if there's no reason to cause trouble, in the sense that, they'd like to invade their neighbors. At least that's their history.